In the merciless heart of the Arizona Territory, 1885, human cruelty and divine mercy collide in a tale that would be whispered around campfires for generations. A young mother, betrayed by those who promised safe passage, now lies abandoned in the scorching desert, robbed of everything but her will to survive and the precious bundle she holds close, her infant child. Vultures circle overhead, nature's patient observers, as her lips crack and her hopes fade with each setting sun. But fate has other plans. 50 miles away, in a sprawling ranch house, a wealthy cowboy hears whispers of a woman gone missing. Something about this story gnaws at his soul, won't let him rest. Against all reason, he saddles his horse and sets out alone, following nothing but broken wagon tracks and his own stubborn heart. What drives a man to risk everything for a stranger's life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Miller discovered early in life that dreams could shatter as easily as the glass in the daguerreotype frame she now held, its edges worn smooth from constant handling. The image showed a younger version of herself, standing proud beside Thomas Sr., her late husband, on their wedding day just 18 months ago. His eyes sparkled with promise, his hand resting protectively over her already swelling belly. Now that photograph was all she had left of him, save the infant sleeping in the makeshift cradle beside her. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canvas of the wagon, casting long shadows across her son's peaceful face. Young Thomas, barely 4 months old, had his father's strong chin and her own dark curls. Sarah traced a finger along his tiny cheek, marveling at how something so perfect could emerge from such profound loss. 6 months ago, the influenza that swept through their Kansas town had taken Thomas Sr. in less than a week, leaving Sarah with a newborn, a mountain of medical debts, and her husband's final words echoing in her ears. "California, Sarah, take our boy to California." The gold rush might have ended years ago, but opportunity still beckoned from the West Coast, where her sister Mary had written of flourishing orchards and endless possibilities. The wagon train had seemed like Providence when it stopped in town. Led by a man named Marcus Fletcher, who carried himself with the authority of a preacher but spoke with a businessman's persuasive charm, the group promised safe passage to Sacramento for a reasonable fee. Sarah had sold everything, the furniture, the farm equipment, even her mother's cherished silver, to secure their spots. "Mrs. Miller," Fletcher's voice called from outside, interrupting her reverie. "We'll be stopping soon to make camp. Best secure your belongings." Sarah carefully wrapped the photograph in a piece of calico and tucked it into her carpet bag. The first week of travel had taught her to be meticulous about storage. The rough terrain showed no mercy to delicate items. She'd already lost one of her few remaining teacups to a particularly jarring bump. The wagon rolled to a stop, and Sarah lifted Thomas into her arms, wrapping him snugly in the quilt her mother had made for his birth. Outside, the evening air carried the scent of sage and dust, familiar companions on their westward journey. The other travelers were already setting up camp with practiced efficiency: the Hansons with their 4 children, the elderly widow Conway, and the 3 Richardson brothers, who kept to themselves at the edges of the group. Fletcher strode through the camp, his coat somehow remaining dust-free despite the day's travel. "Circle the wagons tight tonight," he announced. "We're entering hostile territory." His eyes lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than necessary, and she pulled Thomas closer, trying to shake off a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. "Here, let me help with that." Emma Hanson appeared at Sarah's side, reaching for a water bucket. The older woman had taken Sarah under her wing from the start, sharing travel wisdom and extra portions of her bean stew. "You look tired, dear. Why don't you let me take Thomas while you rest?" Sarah smiled but shook her head. "Thank you, but he'll be fussy without his feeding soon. I'll manage." As she settled near the communal fire, Sarah couldn't help noticing How Fletcher huddled with his associates, their voices too low to carry, but their gestures animated. The Richardson brothers joined them briefly, exchanging what looked like maps or papers, though they quickly disappeared into pockets when others approached. That night, as Thomas nursed quietly in the privacy of her wagon, Sarah pulled out her journal, another wedding gift, its pages now filled with her neat script documenting their journey. "My dearest Thomas," she wrote, as she did each night, pretending she was sharing her thoughts with her late husband. "Something feels different about the air tonight. Perhaps it's just the desert playing tricks, but I find myself counting our remaining funds more often than the miles we've traveled. I pray I'm being foolish, that these shadows in my mind are nothing more than a widow's worries." She didn't finish the entry. Tomorrow would be another long day, and sleep was a precious commodity. But as she drifted off, one hand resting protectively on Thomas's cradle, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed something important, some detail that would later prove crucial. The desert wind whispered against the wagon canvas, carrying with it the faint sound of men's voices and the distant howl of a coyote. Dawn arrived with an unsettling silence. Sarah woke to find Thomas fussing quietly, his usual morning coos replaced by restless whimpers. The camp outside seemed oddly still. No clatter of cooking pots, no morning chatter of the Hanson children. Holding Thomas close, she pushed aside the wagon's canvas flap and stepped into a world turned wrong. The other wagons were gone. For a long moment, Sarah stood frozen, unable to process the empty clearing before her. Where last night 6 wagons had formed a protective circle, now only scattered ashes and trampled grass remained. Her own wagon stood alone against the vast desert landscape, like a forgotten tombstone in an endless cemetery. "Hello?" Her voice cracked as she called out, "Mrs. Hanson? Widow Conway?" Only the wind answered, carrying away her words across the scrubland. Then she noticed the water barrel. Empty. Her hands trembled as she reached for her carpet bag, already knowing what she would find. The careful stack of banknotes, her entire life savings, was gone. In its place lay her empty canteen, its presence a cruel mockery of her situation. "No, no, no!" Sarah frantically searched the wagon, hoping against hope that she was wrong, that this was some terrible mistake. But the truth became clearer with each missing item. They had taken everything of value, the extra food, her mother's silver, even the spare wheels for the wagon. All that remained were a few personal items they deemed worthless. Her journal, the wedding photograph, Thomas's baby clothes. The sound of Thomas's cry snapped her out of her panic. She still had milk for him, thank God, but without water and supplies. Sarah forced herself to think practically, just as she had after Thomas Sr.'s death. First, she needed to know exactly what she had left. The inventory was grim. 1 day's worth of hardtack, her shawl, Thomas's quilt, the clothes they wore, and a small sewing kit. The wagon itself was useless. She discovered they'd taken the horses during the night. Even the wheels had been partially dismantled, stranding her effectively. Sarah climbed to the highest nearby rock, Thomas secured against her chest, and surveyed the landscape. The morning sun was still low enough to cast long shadows, helping her spot the wagon tracks leading west. They must have left hours ago, probably in the darkest part of night. To the east lay the direction they'd come from, but she knew the nearest town was at least 4 days' travel by wagon. A glint of metal caught her eye. Half buried in the sand, near where Fletcher's wagon had been parked, lay a small tin cup. Sarah scrambled down to retrieve it. Any container might mean the difference between life and death. As she picked it up, a piece of paper fluttered from beneath it. The handwriting was crude but legible. "Some debts can only be paid in blood. Your husband should have known better." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas Sr. had never mentioned any debts beyond the medical bills. What had he gotten involved in? Had Fletcher sought them out deliberately? The questions swirled. In her mind, useless now except as confirmation that this abandonment was no accident. Thomas fussed again, and Sarah forced herself to focus. The desert sun was climbing higher, and with it, the temperature. She had to make decisions quickly. The wagon tracks led west, but following them would be suicide. Fletcher and his men were mounted and hours ahead. East meant certain death by exposure. That left north or south. Sarah remembered Thomas Sr. teaching her about the desert during their courtship. He'd spent time as a surveyor before settling down to farm. Water flows downhill, he'd said, and where there's water, there's usually people. The land seemed to slope gradually southward, and in the far distance, she thought she could make out the dark line of mountains. Using the wagon's canvas, Sarah fashioned a sling for Thomas and a crude head covering for herself. She salvaged what she could carry without weighing herself down: the hardtack, the tin cup, her shawl, the sewing kit, Thomas's quilt, and, after a moment's hesitation, the wedding photograph and her journal. Everything else she had to leave behind. "We're going to be all right, little one," she whispered to Thomas, trying to keep her voice steady as she nursed him one last time in the shade of the abandoned wagon. "Your father is watching over us, and God won't abandon us here." But as she spoke the words, a shadow passed overhead, the first vulture of the day, beginning its patient circle. Sarah clutched the empty canteen, its worthlessness now a testament to human cruelty. The morning was still cool enough to walk, but she knew she had only hours before the full force of the desert heat would hit them. Already, the air was beginning to shimmer in the distance, desert mirages dancing on the horizon like mocking spirits. With one final look at the wagon, her last connection to civilization, Sarah turned southward. Each step carried her deeper into the desert's embrace, every footprint marking the beginning of a desperate race against time, thirst, and the merciless sun. Thomas, secured against her chest, had fallen into an uneasy sleep, unaware that his mother's tears were the last moisture either of them would taste for what might be days. The empty canteen bounced against her hip with each step, its hollow sound a constant reminder of Fletcher's betrayal and the precariousness of their situation, but Sarah kept walking, her jaw set with determination. She was Thomas Sr.'s widow, but more importantly, she was Thomas Jr.'s mother, and as long as her child drew breath, she would not surrender to the desert's judgment. James Cooper stood in the pre-dawn light of his ranch house porch, steam rising from his coffee cup as he surveyed his domain. Echo Ridge Ranch spread out before him like a painting, 15,000 acres of Arizona territory that his father had claimed and his own hands had built into something remarkable. The morning sun caught the silver length of the family brand iron hanging by the door, its intertwined EC for Echo Cooper, casting familiar shadows on the weathered wood. At 35, James had accomplished what most men only dreamed of. The ranch was the largest in the territory, its reputation for fine horses drawing buyers from as far as San Francisco. But success had come at a price. One measured in solitary sunrises and empty rooms in a house built for a family he'd never had. Time to create. "Mornin', boss." Miguel, his foreman of 12 years, approached with his own cup of coffee. "Cavalry captain's here early. Says he needs to speak with you." James nodded, his expression neutral despite his curiosity. The military contracts were a significant part of their business, but Captain Harrison rarely appeared unannounced. "He in the office?" "No, sir," insisted on the kitchen. "Says it ain't official business." The kitchen was the heart of the ranch house, where ranch hands and visiting dignitaries alike gathered around Maria's legendary cooking. James found Captain Harrison at the long oak table, his usually pristine uniform showing signs of hard riding. "James," Harrison stood, extending his hand. "Sorry to disturb you so early." "Sit down before Maria sees you standing in her kitchen," James replied, gesturing to the coffee pot. "What brings you out at this hour?" Harrison's face darkened as he settled back into his chair. Caught one of Fletcher's gang last night. You remember that business 2 years ago? James's hand tightened imperceptibly around his cup. Marcus Fletcher had been a thorn in the territory's side for years, running schemes that walked the line between legal and criminal. 2 years ago, he'd graduated to outright murder, leaving 3 settlers dead in what he claimed was an Apache attack. But the bodies had told a different story, one of close-range shots and stolen valuables. He's still operating in the area? James kept his voice level, though the old anger stirred. His father had taught him that a rancher's first duty was to civilization itself, to creating order from chaos. Fletcher represented everything that could turn the territory back into wilderness. That's why I'm here. Harrison leaned forward. Fellow we caught was drunk, talking about a new scheme. They're running wagon trains now, promising safe passage to California. Only the wagons never make it that far. Maria appeared with a plate of biscuits, her dark eyes taking in the serious expressions before tactfully withdrawing. James waited until her footsteps faded. How many? Don't know exactly, but here's what got my attention. Last week in Kansas, they picked up a young widow and her baby. Name's Miller. My sister-in-law wrote about her, said she sold everything to make the journey. Harrison paused. Way our prisoner tells it, Fletcher's got something personal against her family. Plans to leave them in the desert once they're far enough out that no one will find them. The family brand iron caught the morning light again, its shadow longer now. James thought of his father's words the day he'd first pressed that iron into cattle hide. A brand ain't just about ownership, son. It's about responsibility. Everything that bears our mark is under our protection. When did they pass through? James was already calculating distances in his head. 3 days ago, heading west by southwest, following the old Mormon trail for now, but knowing Fletcher, he'll leave that soon enough. James, Harrison hesitated. This isn't your responsibility. I've got patrols out looking, but James was already standing, his mind made up. Your patrols don't know the backcountry like I do. Besides, he allowed himself a grim smile, I've been meaning to test that new stallion we broke last month. Within an hour, the ranch was humming with purposeful activity. Miguel coordinated supplies, while James studied maps in his office, marking water sources and likely routes. He knew Fletcher's type. They'd avoid established trails once they were ready to make their move, seeking the isolation that made their crimes possible. The stallion, a magnificent blood bay named Thunderhead, stamped impatiently as the saddle. Bags were packed. Water, dried beef, medical supplies, and ammunition. James had seen enough desert tragedy to know what might be needed. He strapped on his father's old Colt, its grip worn smooth by years of carry. 2 days, he told Miguel. If I'm not back, send word to Harrison and keep the South Range cattle moving on schedule. Miguel, who had known James since he was a boy learning to rope, simply nodded. Maria's packed extra hardtack. Says to bring them back for a proper meal. The sun was fully up now, promising another scorching day. James mounted Thunderhead, feeling the horse's eager energy beneath him. The family brand iron glinted one last time as he rode past, its shadow pointing west like a compass needle. God help Fletcher if I find him first, James muttered. But his real concern was for the woman and child somewhere out in that vast, unforgiving landscape. The territory's old-timers had a saying. The desert was nature's crucible, burning away everything but the truth of a person's character. In the next few days, James suspected he'd learn the truth about himself as well. The first day of tracking brought James to a bitter understanding of what he was up against. The desert stretched before him like a deadly chessboard, each move potentially fatal. His grandfather's brass compass, worn smooth by 3 generations of Cooper men, rested heavy in his vest pocket, a reminder that in this landscape, being lost meant more than just missing your way. He'd picked up the wagon train's trail easily enough at first. 6 wagons leaving clear marks in the desert soil, following the expected route. But by mid-morning, he'd found the first sign that something was wrong. The tracks had divided. 5 wagons veering northwest toward California, while a single set of tracks continued west into increasingly hostile territory. "They're separating them," he muttered to Thunderhead, who flicked an ear in response, "getting her far enough out that she can't find her way back." James dismounted, crouching to study the ground more closely. The single wagon's tracks were deeper than the others, suggesting it had been heavily loaded. But alongside them, he spotted something that made his jaw tighten: boot prints, multiple sets, moving parallel to the wagon. They were herding her, like cowboys steering a stray heifer to slaughter. The grandfather's compass caught the sunlight as he checked his bearing. The old man's voice echoed in his memory. "A compass only tells you where you're headed, boy. Knowing whether it's the right direction, that comes from in here." He tapped his chest then, right over his heart. James stood, brushing dust from his knees. The sun was climbing toward noon, and already the heat was becoming oppressive. He'd grown up in this territory, knew its moods and dangers like he knew his own reflection, but even he wouldn't want to be out here without proper supplies. The thought of a woman and infant trying to survive, Thunderhead nickered softly, drawing his attention to movement in the distance. A dust devil danced across the landscape, but something about its motion seemed wrong. James pulled his spyglass from his saddlebag, focusing on the disturbance: riders. 3 of them, moving fast and light, heading back the way he'd come. The Richardson brothers, he'd bet his ranch on it. Fletcher's favored enforcers, known for doing the jobs too dirty, for even their boss to handle directly. "They're finished with her then," James said grimly, collapsing the spyglass. That meant Sarah Miller and her child were already alone out there, if they were still alive. The thought spurred him back into the saddle, Thunderhead responding instantly to his urgency. They rode hard for the next few hours, stopping only briefly at midday to water the horse and check their direction. The wagon tracks were becoming harder to follow as the terrain grew rougher, but James had spent too many years tracking strays not to recognize the signs. Broken brush, displaced rocks, the occasional deep rut where the wheels had struggled. Late afternoon brought him to a rise overlooking a broad valley. The sun's angle highlighted the tracks below, and James felt his heart sink. The wagon trail ended abruptly in a clearing, and even from this distance, he could see the vehicle had been partially dismantled. "Easy, boy," he soothed Thunderhead as they picked their way down the slope. The horse's nostrils flared at the scent of recent human presence, but his training held. The abandoned wagon told its own story. James moved methodically around it, reading the signs like a newspaper. They'd taken the horses, of course, and anything of value. But it was the smaller details that painted the fuller picture. A child's toy dropped in haste, a page torn from a Bible scattered by the wind, and most telling, the careful way essential supplies had been removed while personal items were left. "Scattered! This wasn't a robbery gone wrong," he told Thunderhead as he examined the dismantled wheels. "This was planned. They wanted her stranded." The compass seemed to grow heavier in his pocket as he considered his next move. The sun would be setting in a few hours, and tracking in the dark was asking for trouble. But something caught his eye. Footprints, leading south, small and close together, made by someone carrying a heavy burden. James pulled out his father's old pocket watch, another family heirloom that had guided generations of Coopers. The desert would soon transform from furnace to freezer, and if Sarah Miller was out there without shelter— "What do you say, boy?" He patted Thunderhead's neck. "Think you've got a few more miles in you?" The stallion tossed his head as if insulted by the question. James allowed himself a small smile as he remounted. The horse was proving his worth, showing the stamina and sure-footedness that had made the Echo Ridge bloodline famous. Before leaving the clearing, James made one final circuit, gathering what useful items remained: a length of rope, a damaged but serviceable blanket, an overturned tin cup that might still hold water. Each item went into his saddlebags, already mentally cataloguing how they might help once he found the woman and child. The compass pointed south, matching the direction of the footprints, but it was his grandfather's words that truly guided him. Now, the right direction comes from in here. And everything in James Cooper's heart told him that somewhere ahead, in the gathering dusk of the Arizona desert, a mother and child were counting the minutes until help arrived, even if they didn't know it was coming. Sarah's world had narrowed to the rhythm of her footsteps and the weight of Thomas against her chest. Her once pristine shawl, now sun-bleached and torn, served as their only shield against the merciless sun. The fine wool that had once graced church socials in Kansas now told a different story, one of survival written in sweat stains and desert dust. By her best estimate, they'd been walking for 2 days. The hardtack was gone, and her milk was diminishing, Thomas's hungry cries growing weaker with each feeding. She'd found a few prickly pear fruits yesterday, their juice providing temporary relief, but the effort of removing the tiny thorns had left her fingers bleeding. "Just a little further, my love," she whispered to Thomas, though she had no destination in mind. The mountains remained stubbornly distant, floating like a mirage on the horizon. Her cracked lips formed silent prayers with each step, counting. At them like rosary beads, the sun climbed higher, and Sarah forced herself to remember Thomas Sr.'s lessons about desert survival. "Watch the lizards," he'd told her once, explaining how they moved from shade to shade. Now she followed their example, plotting her course between patches of shadow cast by rocky outcroppings and scraggly vegetation. Near midday she spotted a promising cluster of rocks, tall enough to provide shelter until the worst heat passed. As she drew closer, her heart leaped at a familiar sight: the waxy leaves of a desert sage plant. Her mother had used sage tea for everything from fevers to stomach ailments. More importantly, its presence meant there might be water nearby. The day rocks formed a natural alcove, and Sarah nearly wept with relief at the pocket of cool shade within. She eased Thomas from his sling, laying him gently on her shawl. His skin felt too warm, his usually bright eyes dull with dehydration. "Look, what Mama found," she crooned, reaching for the sage. Her hands shook as she stripped a few leaves, placing one in her mouth to chew. The bitter oils provided little moisture, but helped with the thick feeling on her tongue. She wiped a crushed leaf gently across Thomas's lips, and he stirred slightly. At the taste, using her shawl as a shelter, Sarah began examining their sanctuary more closely. Years of wind and rain had carved shallow depressions in the rock face, and in one she found treasure, a small pool of rainwater, no bigger than her palm but wonderfully clean. She nearly cried at the sight, forcing herself to take only tiny sips, saving most for Thomas. As the afternoon heat built, Sarah's mind began to wander. The desert played tricks with light and shadow, turning brush into advancing figures, rocks into waiting wagons. She found herself talking to Thomas Sr., telling him about their son's first smile, his strong grip, how brave he was being. "You'd be so proud of him," she whispered, her voice rough from thirst. "He hasn't complained once, not like those church ladies' babies, always fussing over nothing." She laughed, then caught herself. She had to stay focused. Desert madness could kill as surely as thirst. To keep her mind sharp, she began cataloguing everything in her possession. The shawl, now serving as both shelter and bed, her journal, its pages growing brittle in the dry air, the tin cup she'd found at the wagon site, the sewing kit with its precious needles and thread, Thomas's quilt, and the wedding photograph, which she couldn't bear to abandon. The afternoon wore on, and Sarah noticed something odd about the rocks around them. Some showed signs of tool marks, old ones, worn by weather, but definitely human-made. Following these marks, she discovered a deeper crevice, partially hidden by brush. Inside, protected from sun and wind, she found ancient paintings on the rock wall. Human figures, animals, and most importantly, a series of wavy lines that her time with Thomas Sr. told her might represent water. Native Americans wouldn't have painted water symbols randomly, she reasoned. This place must have some significance. Looking more carefully at the ground, she noticed how the rock formed subtle channels, all leading roughly southeast. If she followed them, they might lead to water, but movement meant leaving their shelter, and the sun still hung high and hostile. Sarah looked at Thomas, dozing fitfully in the relative cool of their alcove. His breathing had grown more labored, and she knew she had to make a decision soon. Stay and conserve energy, but risk running out of water, or move, and possibly miss other shelters before nightfall. She was still weighing her options when the wind shifted, bringing with it an unexpected sound, the distant call of a crow. Sarah's heart quickened. Crows meant water, or at least vegetation substantial enough to support life. The sound came from the same direction as the rock channels. "What do you think, little one?" she asked Thomas, gathering him close. "Shall we trust your father's people to show us the way?" The ancient paintings seemed to shimmer in response, their weathered shapes holding secrets of survival in this harsh land. Sarah waited until the sun began its descent, casting longer shadows across the desert floor. She dipped the corner of her shawl in the remaining rainwater and wrapped it around Thomas's head, praying it would help cool him. The wedding photograph she tucked carefully away. She couldn't risk looking at it now, couldn't afford the luxury of tears. "We're not finished yet," she told the desert air, her voice stronger than she felt. "God didn't bring us this far to lose us now." She adjusted Thomas in his sling and began following the rock channels, moving as quickly as she dared in the fading light. Behind them, the sun-bleached shawl fluttered from a bush where she'd left it, a marker for their shelter if they needed to return, and perhaps, though she didn't let herself dwell on it, a sign for anyone who might be looking for them. The wagon train materialized out of the morning haze like a ghost ship on a desert sea. James reined Thunderhead to a stop on a rise overlooking their camp, studying the scene through his spyglass. 5 wagons arranged in a neat circle, smoke rising from a cooking fire. Everything looking perfectly normal, except for the armed men posted as sentries. No regular wagon train needed that kind of watch. Among the scattered papers he'd found at Sarah's abandoned wagon was a set of travel documents that told their own damning story. The letterhead was impressive, the signatures official-looking, but James had seen enough contracts to spot the forgeries. Fletcher wasn't just robbing these people. He was running an elaborate confidence scheme. "Time to introduce ourselves," James murmured to Thunderhead, patting the horse's neck. They'd ridden through the night to catch up, and now the pre-dawn light gave them the advantage of surprise. He approached openly, letting his horse's hooves sound clearly on the rocky ground. No point in getting shot by jumpy guards. The nearest sentry straightened, rifle raising slightly. "That's close enough," the man called out. James kept his hands visible, voice carrying easily across the morning air. "Looking for Marcus Fletcher. He around." Movement near the central wagon drew his attention. Fletcher emerged, looking exactly as James remembered him, tall and well-dressed, with the smooth manner of a snake oil salesman. "James Cooper," he called out, feigning warmth. "What brings Echo Ridge's finest all the way out here?" "Missing woman and child," James replied evenly. "Thought you might know something about it." Fletcher spread his hands in an exaggerated gesture of innocence. "Lots of folks on the trails these days. Can't keep track of everyone." "Sarah Miller ring a bell? Young widow, infant son?" James watched Fletcher's face carefully. There, a slight tightening around the eyes, quickly masked. "Ah yes, the Miller woman." Fletcher shook his head sadly. Unfortunate business. She left us 3 days ago, said she had relatives in a mining camp. Wouldn't listen to reason about traveling alone. The lie was smooth, practiced. James might have believed it if he hadn't seen the abandoned wagon, hadn't read the forged documents. He shifted slightly in his saddle, letting his coat fall open to reveal his father's Colt. Funny thing about that, he said conversationally. Way I heard it, you had some unfinished business with her husband. Fletcher's mask slipped for just a moment, showing something ugly beneath. More men were emerging from the wagons now, and James counted at least 6 rifles aimed his way. Careful, Cooper, Fletcher warned softly. You're a long way from Echo Ridge. Accidents happen out here. They sure do, James agreed. Like what happened to those settlers 2 years back? The ones you claimed were killed by Apaches? That hit home. Fletcher's face darkened, and he gestured sharply to his men. This isn't your concern, Cooper. Ride away now. We'll forget this conversation happened. Instead, James pulled out the forged travel documents, holding them up. Recognized your handiwork, Marcus. Same paper as those land deeds you were pushing last year. Army's real interested in where you got the official seals. Kill him, Fletcher snapped, but James was already moving. Thunderhead, trained for cutting. Cattle spun on his haunches as shots cracked across the morning air. James dropped the papers, letting them scatter in the wind as he drew his Colt. He didn't aim to kill. Echo Ridge's reputation couldn't afford that kind of attention. But his first shot took Fletcher's hat off, and his second knocked a rifle. From a sentry's hands, the camp erupted into chaos. Women screamed, children cried, and James realized with grim satisfaction that most of Fletcher's passengers were only now understanding their situation. He used the confusion to his advantage. Thunderhead dancing through the camp as he fired carefully placed shots that sent Fletcher's men diving for cover. Your boss stole your money, he shouted to the frightened families. Check your valuables. Those travel papers he gave you are forged. Fletcher was shouting orders, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The Hanson family, James recognized. Them, from Harrison's description, had already discovered their strongbox missing. Widow Conway was confronting one of Fletcher's men about her missing jewelry. You better run, James called to Fletcher, punctuating his words with another shot that splintered a wagon wheel near the man's feet. Army patrols less than half a day behind me. It was a bluff, but Fletcher's nerve broke. He scrambled onto his horse, shouting for his men to follow. Within minutes, they were riding hard to the northwest, leaving their confused and angry victims behind. James holstered his Colt and dismounted, approaching the shaken families. Army'll be here soon, he assured them, making it truth rather than bluff this time. They'll see you safely to California. But first, I need to know everything about when and where you last saw Sarah Miller. The story emerged quickly now. Emma Hanson wept as she described being forced to participate in the deception, how Fletcher's men had threatened her children. If anyone warned Sarah, the Richardson brothers had stationed themselves near her wagon that last night, ensuring she couldn't cry out when they led Sarah's horses away. She had a little money saved, Widow Conway added, her voice bitter with guilt. Fletcher made a show of helping her count it each night, learning exactly what she had. But it was Mr. Hanson who provided the crucial information, pulling James aside to speak privately. Fletcher had papers in his wagon, letters about Thomas Miller, Sarah's husband. Seems Miller witnessed something back in Kansas, something Fletcher's gang did. They've been tracking his family ever since. James felt the pieces click into place. This wasn't just robbery, it was revenge, carefully planned and coldly executed. He thought of Sarah and her child out there in the desert, pawns in Fletcher's cruel game, and his jaw tightened. Which way did you come after leaving her? He asked, already planning his route. Hanson pointed southeast. There's a rock formation, looks like a sleeping giant. They left her just beyond that. James mounted Thunderhead, who seemed to sense his urgency. Army'll want statements from all of you about Fletcher's operation. But right now, there's a woman and child out there running out of time. As he rode away, the scattered papers from Fletcher's wagon danced across the desert like angry ghosts, their forged promises dissolving in the morning sun. James pressed Thunderhead faster, knowing that every minute counted now. The sleeping giant formation loomed ahead, and somewhere, beyond it, Sarah Miller was fighting for survival, unaware that help was finally coming. The broken mirror shard caught the first light of dawn, reflecting Sarah's face in fragments, each piece telling its own story of survival. She'd found it half buried in the sand during the night, probably dropped by some long-ago traveler, and now used it to study her transformation. Cracked lips, sunburned skin peeling across her nose, eyes bright with what she feared might be fever. 3 days in the desert had turned a proper Kansas widow into something wild and desperate. "See, Thomas," she whispered to her son, who lay unnaturally still in her lap. "Still pretty enough for Sunday service." Her attempt at humor died as Thomas failed to respond to her voice. His breathing was shallow, skin hot to the touch, despite the pre-dawn chill. The last drops of her milk had dried up hours ago, her body too dehydrated to produce more. Sarah tucked the mirror shard into her pocket. Another piece of civilization to cling to, like the wedding photograph she couldn't bear to look at anymore. The ancient rock paintings had led them to a dry stream bed yesterday, but any water it once held was long gone. She dug with bleeding hands until exhaustion forced her to stop, finding nothing but damp sand that taunted her parched throat. "Your father would know what to do," she told Thomas, struggling to her feet. Her legs shook with the effort, muscles cramping from dehydration. "He always knew just where to find water. Remember how he'd drill those wells? Everyone said he had. The touch for it." She kept talking, knowing her voice was the only thing keeping panic at bay. "He'd tell us to keep moving. Water flows downhill, that's what he'd say." The sun rose higher, bringing with it the now familiar waves of heat that distorted the horizon. Sarah had learned to distrust her eyes. The shimming mirages had led her astray too many times. Instead, she focused on the ground, watching for signs of life that might indicate water. The tracks of small animals, patches of greener vegetation, the flight patterns of the few birds that braved the desert day. By mid-morning, Thomas had stopped sweating. A bad sign, she knew. Her own skin felt paper dry, and the world had taken on a strange, dreamlike quality. Twice, she caught herself walking in circles, her mind wandering to cool Kansas creeks and rain-washed gardens. "Stay awake," she commanded herself, pinching her arm hard. Stay awake for Thomas, the broken mirror shard pressed against her hip as she walked, its sharp edges a reminder of reality. She pulled it out, using it to signal in wide arcs. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short, the distress signal Thomas Sr. had taught her, though she couldn't remember why anymore. The sun caught the glass, sending brilliant beams across. The desert. Like stars, she thought. Like the stars Thomas Sr. used to name for her on summer nights. A sound made her turn, a coyote's yip, closer than she'd like. They'd been following for hours, growing bolder as she weakened. Sarah clutched, Thomas tighter, knowing she had to find shelter soon. The predators would wait until nightfall, but they would come. "Sing with me, little one," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound!" The hymn felt wrong in the desert silence, but she forced herself to continue. Let the coyotes hear. Let them know she wasn't finished yet. The afternoon brought clouds, real ones, not mirages, building like towers in the eastern sky. Sarah watched them with desperate hope, remembering how afternoon thunderstorms would sweep across the Kansas plains. But these clouds were too high, too distant. They would spend their precious water somewhere else, leaving her with nothing but their shadows. As the sun began to set, Sarah found herself facing a decision she'd been avoiding all day. The mountains still loomed to the south, no closer than before. Her strength was failing, and Thomas needed help now, not in hours or days, but now. She sank to her knees, cradling her son. In the fading light, She could almost pretend he was just sleeping. "I'm sorry," she whispered, touching his fevered cheek. "I'm so sorry, my love." For the first time since their abandonment, she allowed herself to weep, though her body had no tears left to shed. The broken mirror caught the sunset, splitting it into 1,000 pieces. Sarah stared at her fractured reflection, barely recognizing the woman who looked back. In one shard, she saw the proper widow who had joined the wagon train. In another, the desperate mother fighting for her child's life. In a third, something else, something stronger than she'd ever thought possible. "No," she said aloud, her voice startling a nearby lizard. "No, this is not how our story ends." Using the last of her strength, Sarah tore strips from her skirt, wrapping them around her bleeding feet. She fashioned a new sling for Thomas, holding him closer to her heart, where her body might share what little warmth and moisture it had left. The mirror shard she positioned carefully on a high rock, angling it to catch the morning sun. Maybe, she thought, just maybe, the first stars were appearing as she began walking again, using them as guides, just as Thomas Sr. had taught her. The coyotes called to each other in the gathering darkness, but Sarah didn't run. She walked with the steady determination of someone who had moved beyond fear, beyond hope, beyond everything except the next step and the precious bundle against her chest. "Amazing grace," she sang again, louder this time, her broken voice carrying across the desert night. "Was blind, but now I see." She walked through the darkness, counting steps instead of stars, humming hymns between cracked lips. The mirror shard glinted occasionally in the starlight, marking her passage like a broken dream. Behind her, the coyotes followed, patient now. They knew what Sarah was finally admitting to herself, that she was walking into what would either be her salvation or her last night on earth, but she kept walking because that's what mothers do. They keep going when there's nothing left, when hope is just a memory and strength is just a word. They keep going because stopping isn't an option, because the weight in their arms is more precious than their own survival. Sarah Miller walked into the desert night, her son held close, her fractured reflection left behind to catch the morning sun. She walked because she was her son's only chance, his only hope. She walked because she was his mother, and mothers don't give up, not even when the desert demands it. In the pre-dawn darkness, something caught James's eye, a flash of light, brief but distinct, coming from a distant ridge. He pulled Thunderhead to a stop, studying the horizon intently. There it was again. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. A distress signal. His hand went to the silver locket hanging from his saddle horn, his mother's, the last thing she'd given him before the fever took her. He'd grabbed it instinctively when packing for this rescue, though he couldn't have said why. Now, watching those desperate flashes of light, he understood. Some part of him had known he'd need a mother's guidance for what lay ahead. "What do you think, boy?" he murmured to Thunderhead. "Worth a look?" The horse's ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. James had learned to trust his mount's instincts. They'd saved his life more than once in territory. Like this. The sun was rising now, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose. James used his spyglass to scan the ridge where he'd seen the flashes. Something reflective was catching the light. Glass or metal, deliberately positioned. Too intentional to be accident, too regular to be natural. He'd been following Sarah's trail for hours, having picked it up again after his confrontation with Fletcher's wagon train. The signs told a story that made his jaw clench. Stumbling footprints growing further apart as exhaustion set in. Places where she'd clearly stopped to rest, desperate attempts to dig for water in dry stream beds. "Come on," he urged Thunderhead forward, keeping one eye on that distant ridge. The horse picked his way carefully through the rocky terrain, his breeding showing in every sure-footed step. James had trained him personally, spending countless hours teaching him to track cattle through worse country than this. Now those same Skills might help save 2 lives. The morning grew hotter as they rode, the sun climbing mercilessly overhead. James watched for signs, noting how the scattered vegetation bent slightly southward, shaped by prevailing winds that sometimes brought rain. If Sarah had any of her husband's surveyor knowledge, she might have noticed the same thing. Near midday, they came upon a sheltered alcove that showed recent signs of habitation. James dismounted, examining the area with practiced eyes. Someone had slept here, leaving behind clear impressions in the sandy soil. A few sage leaves had been stripped from a nearby plant, and he found tiny fragments of a precious water pool scraped nearly dry. "Smart woman," he said softly, finding marks that suggested she'd noted the ancient petroglyphs on the rock face. Following her likely line of sight, he spotted the subtle channels in the rock that indigenous peoples had used for generations to find water. But it was what he found next that made his heart race. Caught on a thorny bush, a piece of sun-bleached wool cloth fluttered like a flag. James recognized it as part of a woman's shawl, deliberately placed. Sarah Miller wasn't just surviving, she was leaving markers, showing a presence of mind that impressed him even as it worried him. Only desperate people left such clear signs. His mother's locket seemed to grow warmer against the saddle leather. James had seen enough death in the desert to know how quickly it could come, how the line between life and death could be as thin as a shadow. But he'd also seen impossible survivals, moments when human will defied nature itself. Thunder rumbled. In the distance, one of the afternoon storms that often threatened but rarely delivered. Still, James studied the clouds with practiced eyes. They were high and likely dry, but their shadows might offer brief respite from the heat. Movement caught his attention. A coyote, slinking away as Thunderhead's scent reached it. The predator's presence this time of day was unusual, suggesting it had been following potential prey. James's hand tightened on his reins. Then he saw it, a flash of white against the red earth ahead. Urging Thunderhead forward, his breath caught as the shape resolved itself, a child's blanket, dropped or abandoned in the night. Nearby, the sand held clear tracks, fresher than any he'd seen so far. "Easy now," he soothed Thunderhead, who had caught a scent and was growing eager. James studied the signs before him with careful attention. The footprints showed someone stumbling, barely able to walk. They led south, toward a line of darker rocks that promised shade. His spyglass revealed more, a figure barely visible in the shadow of a large boulder. Someone sitting or lying down, motionless. James felt his chest tighten. After all this, but then something moved, a small motion but unmistakable. The figure was alive. "Go," he whispered to Thunderhead, and the horse responded instantly, eating up the distance with powerful strides. As they drew closer, James could make out more details. A woman's dress, torn and dust-covered, dark hair falling loose around her shoulders. And clutched to her chest, a small bundle that stirred weakly. The mother's locket bounced against his saddle, its silver surface catching the sun like a beacon. James Cooper had spent his life learning the desert's harsh lessons, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. In the space of a heartbeat he saw everything, the strength it had taken to come this far, the love that had kept 2 hearts beating against impossible odds, the sheer human will to survive that had led him to this exact spot. "Hold on," he called out, though he knew she probably couldn't hear him yet. "Hold on, I'm coming." The thunder growled again, closer now, and a few drops of rain began to fall, the desert offering its own salvation to those who had earned it through suffering and determination. James pressed Thunderhead faster, the mother's locket guiding him home to a woman and child who had refused to let the desert write their final chapter. James dismounted before Thunderhead fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground running. The handmade travois he'd fashioned from spare blankets and stirrup leathers bounced against his saddle, a ranger's trick for transporting the wounded that he'd prayed he wouldn't need. Now, seeing Sarah's condition up close, he was grateful for the precaution. "Ma'am? Mrs. Miller?" He approached slowly, hands visible, voice gentle. She didn't respond, but her arms tightened protectively around the bundle against her chest. Even, nearly unconscious, a mother's instincts ran deep. "I'm James Cooper from Echo Ridge Ranch. I'm here to help." He knelt beside her, professional assessment warring with human anguish. Her skin was hot and dry, a bad sign, meaning her body had stopped sweating. The baby's breathing was shallow but present. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, cracked lips moving soundlessly. James uncapped his canteen, years of experience guiding his movements. "Just a few drops at first," he murmured, supporting her head. "Too much too fast will make you sick." The water seemed to revive her slightly. "Thomas," she managed to whisper. "Help, Thomas." "I've got you both," James promised, carefully examining the infant. The child was dehydrated but alive, protected by his mother's body and determination. Using his bandana, James dripped water onto Thomas's lips, relief flooding him when the baby's tongue moved reflexively. The travois would be essential now. James worked quickly, speaking constantly in low, reassuring tones as he secured Sarah and Thomas onto the makeshift stretcher. The mother refused to release her child even in her semi-conscious state, so James arranged them together, using his spare blankets to create a shelter against the sun. "Thunderhead," he called softly, and the horse moved closer, understanding the delicacy of the situation. James had trained him for cattle work, but the stallion seemed to sense that his current cargo was infinitely more precious. "Stay with me, Mrs. Miller," James encouraged as he mounted up, checking the travois angle. "I know you're tired, but I need you to keep fighting a little longer." He turned Thunderhead toward home, choosing their path carefully to minimize jolts to his passengers. The desert, as if acknowledging the rescue, offered a rare mercy, clouds thick enough to provide genuine shade. James kept one eye on the weather and another on his patients, stopping regularly to give them small sips of water. Each time, Sarah's first concern was for Thomas, her maternal instinct burning stronger than her fever. "My baby," she murmured. During one such stop, her voice stronger but confused. "I can't feel him." "He's right here," James assured her, guiding her hand to Thomas's chest so she could feel his heartbeat. "You kept him alive, Mrs. Miller. You did the impossible." The travois proved its worth over that long afternoon, its design spreading their weight and smoothing the journey as much as possible. James found himself talking more than he had in months, sharing stories of Echo Ridge, describing Maria's cooking, anything to keep Sarah connected to the world of the living. "Almost home," he promised as the sun began to set. "Just hold on a little longer. You've made it this far. Don't give up now." The travois swayed gently behind them, carrying its precious cargo toward safety, each step taking them further from death's door. Mother and child, bound together by love and determination, had survived the desert's judgment. Now they just had to survive the rescue. The brass key to the ranch house's north wing caught the lantern light as James turned it, the familiar click of the lock echoing in the quiet night. He'd never used these rooms, kept pristine since his mother's passing, but their proximity to the kitchen and their private bathroom made them perfect for his recovering guests. "Maria," he called softly to his housekeeper, who was already turning down the bed linens. "How's the doctor's timing?" 10 minutes, Senor Cooper. I have water heating for the lady's bath." Her efficient movements belied her obvious concern as she arranged pillows and laid out clean towels. They'd spotted Thunderhead's approach from miles out, and the ranch house had sprung into action like a well-oiled machine. Sarah stirred slightly as James carried her inside, Thomas still cradled against her chest. Even in her weakened state, she hadn't relinquished her hold on her son. The cool darkness of the room seemed to ease some of her tension, and her cracked lips moved in what might have been a sigh of relief. "You're safe now," James assured her, carefully settling her on the bed. "The doctor's coming, and Maria here will help get you both cleaned up and comfortable." Miguel appeared in the doorway, his usual stoic expression softening at the sight of mother and child. "Dr. Roberts just passed the south gate, boss, and I've got the men setting up a watch rotation, just in case Fletcher gets any ideas." James nodded his thanks, reluctantly stepping back as Maria took charge. The housekeeper's gentle hands were already untangling Sarah's matted hair, murmuring soothing words in a mix of English and Spanish. Thomas whimpered as Maria carefully examined him, but his cry had more strength than before, a good sign. The key felt heavy in James's pocket as he left them in Maria's capable care. That key had last been used by his mother, opening these rooms to guests in need of shelter and healing. She'd called it her mercy wing, and James finally understood why she'd made him promise to keep it ready. Dr. Roberts arrived in a flurry of activity, his bag already open as he strode through the door. "Dehydration. Exposure, I assume?" he asked briskly, pulling out his stethoscope. "Yes, but they're both fighters," James replied, watching from the doorway as the doctor began his examination. "She kept that baby alive for 3 days in the desert." The doctor's experienced hands moved efficiently, checking vital signs and responses. "She'll need careful rehydration. Too much too fast could shock the system. The infant—" He paused, listening to Thomas's chest. "Remarkable. She must have shielded him with her own body. A few more hours out there?" He didn't need to finish the thought. James had seen enough desert tragedies to know how close it had been. But as he watched Maria and the doctor work, saw color slowly returning to Sarah's cheeks as they administered small sips of water, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his mother's death, the sense of his house becoming a home again. The key in his pocket seemed to warm slightly, as if approving of its renewed purpose. These rooms, silent for so long, were once again fulfilling their destiny as a sanctuary for those in need, just as his mother had intended. The small wooden rattle was the first gift James brought to Thomas, a simple thing carved by one of the ranch hands, its gentle sound drawing the first real smile they'd seen from the baby. Sarah held it now, watching her son grasp at the smooth wood with recovering strength, each musical shake a reminder of how far they'd come in just a few days. "He's getting his spirit back," Maria observed, setting down a breakfast tray laden with soft-boiled eggs and warm broth. Like his mama, the housekeeper had become Sarah's fierce protector, managing her recovery with a grandmother's wisdom and a sergeant's discipline. Sarah's voice was still rough, but growing stronger. "I never properly thanked Mr. Cooper, James, for finding us, for everything." "He won't hear of thanks," Maria replied, adjusting the curtains to let in more morning light. "But he stops by that door 6 times a day, pretending to check on ranch business." Her knowing smile spoke volumes. It was true. James had maintained a respectful distance, understanding that Sarah needed time to recover not just physically, but from the trauma of betrayal. Yet his presence was constant in small ways. Fresh flowers appearing on the bedside table, books selected from his library, reports from the army about Fletcher's pursuit. The rattle chimed again as Thomas tested his new toy, and Sarah marveled at her son's resilience. The desert had nearly claimed them both, but children, she was learning, lived more in the present than the past. Each day brought new strength, new discoveries, new reasons to look forward rather than back. Dr. Roberts visited daily, his initial concern giving way to cautious optimism. "Keep this up," he said during his morning check, "and you'll be taking walks in the garden by week's end." Sarah nodded, but her hands tightened slightly on the rattle. The thought of open spaces still triggered memories of those desperate days. Yet she knew she couldn't let fear win. couldn't let Fletcher's cruelty shape her future or Thomas's. The roses are blooming, Maria mentioned casually, noting Sarah's tension. And the kitchen garden needs experienced eyes. My tomatoes aren't half what they were when... She stopped, something sad and fond crossing her face. When? Sarah prompted. Gently. When Mrs. Cooper was alive, Maria finished. She had a way with growing things, like you with that little one there. The rattle's song filled the quiet that followed, Thomas unknowingly bridging the gap between past and present, between loss and new beginnings. Sarah looked down at her son, seeing not just his recovery, but his future. A future she hadn't dared imagine in those dark desert hours. Perhaps, she said slowly, we could look at the garden tomorrow, just for a little while. Maria's smile was like sunrise. Si, Signora, just for a little while. The wooden rattle kept time with their hope, its melody promising that even in the desert of loss, new life could take root and flourish. The silver badge on Captain Harrison's chest caught the morning light as he delivered the news, its official gleam matching the satisfaction in his eyes. We got them, James. Every last one of Fletcher's gang, including the man himself. Sarah sat in the ranch house parlor, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms as Harrison laid out the details. James stood by the fireplace, his quiet presence lending her strength as she heard how justice had finally caught up with her husband's killers. Found those forged documents you scattered at their camp, Harrison continued. Led us right to their operation in Kansas. Turns out your husband wasn't their only victim, Mrs. Miller. They'd been running this scheme for years. Sarah's voice was steady as she asked, did Fletcher say why? Why Thomas? Why us? Harrison exchanged a glance with James before answering. Your husband witnessed them murdering a bank clerk during a robbery 3 years ago. Fletcher's been eliminating potential witnesses ever since, making each death look like an accident or random crime. The badge seemed to grow brighter as Harrison leaned forward. But here's what Fletcher didn't know. Your husband wrote everything down. Sealed letter to the Kansas authorities, to be opened in the event of his death. When we arrested Fletcher, that letter was already waiting in evidence. Thomas always was thorough, Sarah said softly, remembering her husband's careful nature. Even in death, he'd protected them one last time. James spoke for the first time. What happens now? Fletcher and his men will hang, Harrison stated flatly. Too many bodies. Too much evidence. The territory's had enough of men like him. He turned to Sarah. We'll need your testimony about the wagon train scheme, Mrs. Miller, but you won't have to travel. Judge Wilson has agreed to ride circuit. Here. Sarah looked down at her sleeping son, then back at the captain's badge, symbol of the law that had finally caught up with her husband's murderers. I'll testify. For Thomas and for all the others they hurt. After Harrison left, James remained by the fireplace, watching Sarah with quiet concern. You did well, he said simply. She managed a small smile. It feels strange, knowing they can't hurt anyone else, but also knowing why Thomas, why my husband died. She touched her son's cheek. He saved others by speaking up, and he saved us by writing that letter. He was a brave man, James agreed. His son comes by it honestly. Sarah stood carefully, mindful of Thomas's sleep. I think I'd like to visit the garden, the roses Maria mentioned. It was her way of saying she wouldn't let fear win, wouldn't let Fletcher's evil poison her future. James nodded, understanding what wasn't said. I'll walk with you if you'd like. The captain's badge had brought justice, but it was the simple act of walking into the sunlight, her son in her arms and James Cooper beside her, that brought Sarah her first real sense of peace since Thomas's death. Justice wouldn't bring her husband back, but it would ensure his sacrifice meant something, and perhaps, just perhaps, it would help her heart begin to heal. The packet of garden seeds lay open on the kitchen table. their promise of new life catching Sarah's attention as she helped Maria plan the week's meals. She recognized the careful handwriting on the paper packet. James had ordered them specially from back east, the same varieties her mother-in-law had grown in Kansas. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, Maria read over her shoulder. Good, sturdy plants, like you, Senora. The housekeeper's knowing smile suggested she was talking about more than just vegetables. 2 months had passed since their rescue, and Sarah found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with surprising ease. Thomas was thriving, crawling, now and attempting to pull himself up on furniture, his baby laughs echoing through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. The soil here is different, Sarah mused, running her fingers over the seeds. But good things can grow in unexpected places. She'd learned that lesson well, watching how her son had bloomed in the desert air, how her own heart had begun to put down new roots. James found them later that morning, Sarah already on her knees in the kitchen garden, Thomas safely corralled, in a makeshift playpen of wooden crates where he could watch his mother work. The rancher paused, taking in the scene with an expression that made Maria quietly excuse herself. "My mother would have liked this," he said, coming to stand beside the garden plot. "She always said a working garden meant a home, not just a house." Sarah sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. "Maria's told me about her. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. James knelt down, examining the neat rows Sarah had already planted. "These are good straight lines. You've done this before." "My mother-in-law taught me," Sarah replied, then hesitated before adding, "Thomas, my husband, used to tease that I took to gardening better than he ever did to farming." It was the first time she'd spoken of her late husband without pain clouding her voice. James seemed to recognize the significance, his next words carefully chosen. "A garden needs strong roots to survive, but it also needs room to grow in new directions." Their eyes met over the freshly turned earth, understanding passing between them. Sarah had noticed how James watched her with her son, how he'd modified the ranch house to make it safer for a curious baby, how he sought her opinion on matters that could have easily been decided without her. "Mr. Cooper, James," she began, but Thomas chose that moment to voice his displeasure at being ignored. They both laughed as Sarah rose to fetch him, James's hand steadying her elbow with familiar care. "He's got good timing," James observed, reaching out to let Thomas grab his finger. "Takes after his mama that way." Sarah settled Thomas on her hip, aware of how natural it felt to stand here with James, planning new growth in soil that had once seemed too harsh to nurture anything gentle. The packet of seeds had started as a simple gift, but like everything at Echo Ridge, it had become something more. A symbol of possibilities, of life continuing, of love growing in unexpected places. "Would you like to help me plant the carrots?" she asked, surprising herself with the invitation. "Thomas can supervise." James's smile was as warm as the Arizona sun. "I'd like that very much, Mrs. Miller." "Sarah," she corrected softly. I think it's time you called me Sarah." The seeds waited patiently in their packet as two people who had known loss began carefully planting something new, watched over by a baby boy who had survived the desert to find himself home at last. The sheet music for Beautiful Dreamer lay yellowed but intact on the piano's music stand, its pages speaking of evenings long past when James's mother had filled the ranch house with melody. Sarah had discovered it while helping Maria clean. The parlor, her fingers tracing the familiar notes with unexpected longing. "Do you play, Senora?" Maria had asked, noticing how Sarah's hands lingered over the keys. "I used to teach piano before I married Thomas," Sarah admitted. "It seems a lifetime ago now." Word traveled fast at Echo Ridge. That evening, James appeared in the parlor doorway as Sarah was putting Thomas to bed. "Mother's piano hasn't been touched in years," he said quietly, "except for dusting. It would be a shame to let it sit silent much longer." Sarah looked at the instrument, a fine Steinway that must have been a challenge to transport to the territory. "Are you sure? It was your mother's." "She would have wanted it played," James replied simply. "Music belongs in a home." The next afternoon found Sarah at the piano, Thomas contentedly playing with wooden blocks nearby. Her fingers were stiff at first, remembering long-forgotten patterns, but muscle memory ran deep, and soon the opening notes of Beautiful Dreamer floated through the ranch house. Ranch hands found excuses to pass by the parlor windows. Maria lingered over her cleaning. Even Thunderhead, grazing in the near paddock, lifted his head at the sound, but it was James's expression, watching from his study door, that made Sarah's heart skip a measure. "My mother used to play that," he said when she finished. "On Sunday evenings after dinner." Sarah nodded, understanding. The gift of trust he'd given her. "Would you like to hear another? I remember quite a few hymns." Soon, evening music became a tradition at Echo Ridge. Ranch hands would gather on the porch after supper, boots cleaned and hair smoothed, while Sarah played everything from church songs to popular ballads. Thomas would crawl between admirers, collecting treats and attention, his happy babbles a counterpoint to the melody. One evening, as Sarah played Sweet By and By, she felt James standing behind her, close enough that she could sense his warmth. Thomas had fallen asleep in his arms, a sight that no longer surprised anyone at the ranch. "You've brought something back to Echo Ridge," James said softly when the song ended. "Something I didn't realize was missing." Sarah's fingers rested on the keys, the sheet music before her blurring slightly. "You gave us a home when we had nothing. Music seems a small repayment." "Is that all it is? Repayment?" She turned on the piano bench to face him, taking in the sight of her son sleeping peacefully against James's shoulder. The sheet music rustled softly in the evening breeze from the open window, its aged pages carrying memories of another woman who had filled this house with music and love. "No," Sarah whispered. "That's not all it is." James shifted Thomas gently, freeing one hand to touch Sarah's cheek. "Play another?" he asked, but his eyes said much more. Sarah turned back to the keys, her heart beating a new rhythm as she began, "Home, Sweet Home." The old sheet music seemed to glow in the lamplight, blessing this moment when music and love were once again weaving their magic through the rooms of Echo Ridge. The gold ring had belonged to James's grandmother, its simple design reflecting the practical beauty of a frontier marriage. He'd retrieved it from the bank in town that morning, his mother's instructions from years ago echoing in his memory. "Give this to someone who understands that love isn't just about romance. It's about building something lasting together." The evening sun painted Echo Ridge in shades of amber as James helped Sarah mount his gentlest mare. Thomas, securely fastened in a special sling Maria had designed, giggled at the height. These evening rides had become their ritual over the past months, a time when the day's work was done and the desert air turned sweet with cooling promises. "There's something I want to show you," James said, leading them toward the western ridge. Sarah raised an eyebrow. They usually rode east, where the terrain was easier, but she trusted him completely now. The trail wound upward, offering expanding views of the ranch below. Sarah had learned to ride well, handling her mount with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything at Echo Ridge. Thomas babbled happily, pointing at passing birds and reaching for the horse's mane. Near the ridgetop, James drew them to a halt. "Just over this rise," he said, helping Sarah dismount. He lifted Thomas from his sling, settling the boy on his hip with practiced ease. They crested the hill together, and Sarah gasped. Below them stretched a hidden valley, its floor carpeted with late-blooming wildflowers. A small stream, rare, treasure in this territory, traced a silver path through the center, feeding a grove of cottonwood trees that glowed golden in the setting sun. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed. "How did I not know this was here? My father called it Cooper's." "Promise," James explained, leading her to a flat rock perfect for sitting. "Said it was the valley that convinced him to build Echo Ridge. Even in the worst droughts, that stream never runs dry." Thomas squirmed to be set down, immediately fascinated by nearby flowers. Sarah watched him explore, her face softening with maternal pride. "He's so confident now. Sometimes I forget he's the same baby who—" She trailed off, the memory of their desert ordeal still tender. "You gave him that confidence," James said quietly. "By never giving up, by showing him that love can overcome anything." He reached into his vest pocket, fingers brushing the ring. "You've taught me the same thing." Sarah turned to him, something shifting in her expression as she caught his tone. The setting sun painted her face in warm light, highlighting the strength and grace that had first caught his attention. "Sarah," James began, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm not a man for fancy words, but I know what I want, what Echo Ridge needs, what Thomas needs." He withdrew the ring, its gold catching the last sunlight. "What I hope you might need too." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears sparkling in her eyes. Thomas, sensing the moment's importance, toddled back to them, reaching for both their hands. "We've both known loss," James continued, holding the ring out to her. "We know love isn't something to take for granted. But I believe, that sometimes God gives us a second chance at happiness, if we're brave enough to take it." The ring glowed between them like a promise made solid. "I'm asking if you'll make Echo Ridge your home permanently, if you'll let me be a father to Thomas and a husband to you, if you'll help me build something even more beautiful than what we have now." Sarah looked at the ring, at Thomas, at the valley spread before them in all its evening glory. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out, not to take the ring, but to touch James's face. "Home isn't just a place," she said softly. "It's the people who help you build it." Her smile bloomed like the wildflowers around them. "Yes, James Cooper, yes to all of it." As he slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, Thomas clapped, his small hands in delight. Above them, the first stars appeared in the deepening purple sky, witnesses to a moment when past sorrows transformed into future joys, and a hidden valley became the cradle of a new beginning. The wedding quilt spread across Sarah's bed on the morning of her marriage, its intricate pattern telling the story of love born from adversity. Every woman at Echo Ridge had contributed a square. Maria's piece showed desert flowers blooming. Through rock, Emma Hansen, who had traveled from California for the ceremony, stitched a mother and child surrounded by guardian angels. The ranch hands' wives added symbols of home and hearth. "It's the old tradition," Maria explained, smoothing the quilted surface. "Each square is a blessing, a wish for your future together." Sarah touched the central square, where skilled hands had embroidered the Echo Ridge brand, intertwined with rippling waves, desert and water, strength and nurture. James and herself united. Her eyes misted as she recognized the artistry of the local women who had welcomed her into their community. Thomas, resplendent in his tiny suit, toddled around the room clutching the ring pillow, practicing his important role. "Mama, pretty," he declared, patting the white fabric of Sarah's dress with small, careful hands. The dress itself was a gift from James's aunt in Boston, but Maria and the other women had altered it to incorporate pieces of Sarah's first wedding dress, saved from the desert ordeal. "Something old, something new," they'd said, understanding how important it was to honor both past and present. The wedding quilt would grace their bed that night, but for now it served as backdrop while Sarah dressed, each woman present adding her own touch to the bride's preparation. Maria pinned the veil, Emma arranged the bouquet of desert wildflowers, and little Elena Hansen, who had appointed herself Thomas's special guardian, kept the ring-bearer entertained. James is pacing the garden like a stallion at auction, Miguel reported, knocking discreetly before speaking through the door. Pastor Williams arrived early and is trying to calm him down with scripture. Sarah smiled, remembering James's insistence that they marry in the very garden where they had first begun to fall in love. The roses were in full bloom now, their fragrance carrying on the morning breeze through the open window. The quilt caught the sunlight as Sarah turned for a final look in the mirror. In its squares, she saw not just the community's blessing on her marriage, but a map of the journey that had brought her here. From desperate mother fighting for survival to beloved bride, from widow to woman ready to love again, from stranger to the heart of Echo Ridge itself. "Ready, Senora?" Maria asked softly, lifting Thomas into her arms. Sarah nodded, her voice steady with certainty. "Ready." The wedding quilt remained on display as Sarah made her way to the garden, its story of love and redemption watching over the moment when one chapter would end and another would begin. In its carefully stitched squares lay the promise that no matter what the future held, Sarah, James, and Thomas would face it wrapped in the warmth of family, friendship, and unshakable love. The family portrait hung in the parlor of Echo Ridge Ranch, capturing a moment 1 year after Sarah and James's wedding. The photographer had caught them in natural poses, James standing proud but relaxed, one hand resting on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah seated, her smile radiant as she held their newborn daughter, and Thomas, now a sturdy toddler, perched on his stepfather's hip, one small hand reaching toward his baby sister. The portrait had been James's idea, a way to document their family's growth and healing, but it was Sarah who insisted on having it taken in front of the garden she'd brought back to life, the roses blooming behind them like a reminder of love's ability to flourish in the harshest places. "Margaret Rose Cooper," Sarah would tell her, "daughter in years to come," naming her for both James's mother and the flowers that had witnessed their love's beginning. "You were born in a house that knows how to turn strangers into family." The ranch had prospered that year, as if reflecting the joy of its inhabitants. The Cooper brand now marked not just cattle, but some of the territory's finest horses, with buyers coming from as far as San Francisco to bid on Echo Ridge stock. James had expanded the operation, but always made time for evening rides with his family, teaching Thomas to handle his first pony while Sarah carried Margaret in a custom sling. Those who had known the ranch in darker days said Echo Ridge had finally lived up to its name, the happy sounds of children's laughter echoing off the rocks, Sarah's piano music floating through the evening air, and James's deep laugh joining the chorus of a home fully alive at last. The portrait caught all of this somehow, the love, the healing, the promise of a future built on strength and tenderness in equal measure. It hung as testament to the truth that even in the desert, with faith and courage, the most beautiful gardens could grow.